Hello. On today's 14th episode of Society Blends, I will be presenting to you my opinion on how modern web browsers changed our perspective and creative potential. I will be covering some facts about the past development of web browsers and how much their evolution changed the way we interact with data. Of course, not focusing on technicalities, but certain features that stood out and later become essential. And also mention some of the facts that are important for the current situation and some developments that might matter in the future. And of course, in the end, I will say how I think web browsers changed our perspective. And of course, cover a bit about the creative potential, although I'm pretty sure it's going to be readily obvious what I will be focusing upon. All right, so before we had web browsers, we had to use modems, and the most likely way in which we communicated was using a bulletin board system, which is reminiscent mostly of a bulletin board or a forum, or however you want to call it today, less so through website. However, it stands to reason that everything pertaining to the way in which information was organized and the way in which we interacted with it and our expectations, especially for the generation that used these services, later became common in web interaction. And all of these expectations later carried on. And I think they are important because most of what we see as the web today was mostly designed during the time when text was the most important way to convey any kind of information. And of course, this is one of the reasons for which the current web is not necessarily optimized and has all sorts of issues pertaining to how it presents information. But of course, without this essential piece of history, we may not understand why things are as they are today. So this was the way in which in the late 80s information was organized, and of course in the early 90s this was still the main way to interact. Of course, since network connections were not very fast, and since computers were not advanced in order to present a graphical interface with enough ability to change it quickly, it meant that text interaction was the only way to handle the internet back then. Of course, in the early 90s, things changed, and we got very quickly to the situation that we see over here. Because in 1993, as mentioned over here, and CSA, Mosaic, one of the most prominent web browsers, of course, not necessarily due to its technology, but more due to the trend it started, was released on the internet. Of course, the first years after its release, it was not massively successful due to the fact that most of the information was not already available in the HTML format that we know all too well, and of course, since Windows and graphical environments were not as massively popular as they were just 1 or 2 years later. So in 1993, the development of such a graphical web browser was not considered to be a real milestone for what was to come. However, it became so because even if it wasn't the best web browser, it was purchased by Microsoft, and Microsoft set very ambitious standards about the web, and it meant that most of what later Microsoft pursued would not have been possible without them developing either their own web browser or purchasing third-party developed technology, as was happening over here. However, what is more important, rather than the application itself, is the fact that Microsoft created an ecosystem that was focused on media, news, and of course other interaction possibilities that they had in their mind when they purchased the web browser. So for them it was the window towards their larger plan of creating a massive internet presence. And of course later developments of the MSN network, the Microsoft network, and the way in which most of the information was presented was true to this strategy. However, there is also another piece of missing technology I want to mention, but in brief. I think that around 1992, and especially so in 1993, major web services such as America Online, CompuServe, and others focused on creating a graphical interface to access their proprietary platforms. And this was a massive success because it was the first major competition to the previously text-only interaction that could be made on the internet. And all this very simple way of sorting information was actually what later spurred the web browser and the access to any sort of information available on the internet. So we should see these two major stages converging, because web browsers and graphical user interfaces to access the internet were not necessarily developed in a singular way, were separate developments that ultimately converge due to the web browser's success. Because ultimately what started as an independent network, just like CompuServe and America Online were, later became an opportunity to access the whole of internet with websites, domains, and so many other ways in which information was structured. And since this evolution was so important and it happened in less than 5 years for most users, it meant that there was a massive impetus, there was a massive influence and will to make a lasting change. And in this context, web browsers could easily adapt to the web as it developed later, while those platforms, those proprietary platforms, could not make sure to cover all of this. So ultimately, they became quite stale, and as more popular web services were better developed and had more information available, those proprietary platforms grew less and less important. And the rise of the World Wide Web as we see today could not be considered without those intermediate steps. So, as I mentioned, the NSA Mosaic was the first modern web browser, if we consider that, because it had a graphical interface, it had the ability to show web pages that also could contain images. And I think this was a massive development, even if back then loading an image was horrendously slow. However, later as technology evolved, this was entirely possible, and it meant a full revolution in the way in which we handle information and the way in which we expect information to be shown to us. So 1993 is the first major year. Netscape was another very important competitor that came just a bit later, and that shaped again most of the web development that happened later. You have to think that the competition between Internet Explorer and Netscape was the most important one of the 90s. And even in the early 2000s, although the competition was won at the time by Internet Explorer, considering the market share and the availability of the web browser on any Windows machine. Netscape Navigator, however, was a very successful product. And later, what was developed out of Netscape Navigator became, if I'm not mistaken, part of what the Mozilla initiative and later Mozilla Firefox came as a product. So it matters a lot that those early developments later led to an evolution that was quite stable and improved capabilities in just about any respect. As you can see on this interface, even if we are talking about a program that was designed in 1998, it covers most of the graphical interface capabilities that we are so used today. Bookmarks, navigation backwards and forwards, depending on where we are. The concept of having a home page and so many other tools that we got so accustomed to during the early days of the modern graphical internet. And all of these details have to be considered. Most of what browsers do today is centered on what web browsers did before the 2000s. Of course, there were major improvements, and I will cover them as well. But the foundation ultimately of what web browsers came to be is set on this time period. And I will show you another very important milestone in my opinion. In 2008, Google releases the Chrome web browser. It was important for a couple of reasons. First of all, up until that point, Mozilla Firefox and Internet Explorer were the most important web browsers. It was a competition that was quite stable. However, the moment Google entered the web browser market, it had very ambitious goals. The goal was not only to develop a browser, but to develop a whole ecosystem that was centered around accessing the internet using Google-made tools. And this meant the web browser was a centerpiece. The web browser they developed over here was the foundation for what later became the Chrome operating system, and most of the features they experimented with on the Chrome development were also introduced in their Android development. So it was both an opportunity and a cost to them to develop a web browser, but it paid off in most situations because they had quite a good follow-up with services. And even if they haven't quite made it mandatory to use a specific web browser to access their features, it was quite obvious that it became a very easy choice to make, because Google became the most prominent search engine. Since it became so well known, it was very easy for them to market a web browser, even if it wasn't that successful. It had to be, let's say, it had to have just an average performance, and it was enough. The fact that it was promoted through Google was the major selling point. Later on, Google Chrome became even more prominent due to the features it included and the better capability of it running modern websites that of course were developed later. And since Microsoft was not able to divert enough resources in order to improve Internet Explorer, and since the code base was quite old and of course they catered to enterprise clients, meant that Internet Explorer development became quite stale. So the major competition was between Mozilla Firefox and Google Chrome. And later on this became very important because Google could divert so many resources in the web browsers just because they created a vast income through all their services, that it became a natural choice for many users to use Chrome despite the very good Firefox alternative. And of course, all of this led to an environment where we are mostly closer to a monopoly that we see today, with Google Chrome having the biggest market share, Mozilla Firefox having a dwindling market share that may slightly fade to obscurity. Unfortunately, I have to say that I think the market share of Mozilla Firefox is around 10%, which is very low. And of course, a similar market share could be attributed to the Microsoft Edge browser, perhaps even slightly higher in recent years due to the way in which they handle development. Of course, I have to say that Google Chrome and Microsoft Edge, or at least the current version of Microsoft Edge, because they had a separate project that was killed and later on it moved to the Chromium base, which is similar to Google Chrome, meant that ultimately there are only two major platforms. The Chromium one that is used both by Google Chrome and Microsoft Edge, of course with optimization and differences that are specific to each developer, and the one of Mozilla Firefox that is used for its browser. Of course, Apple also exists in this picture, but the prominence of Safari as a web browser, I think, is not higher than 10%. So most of the market is being centered on Chrome, that I think has around a 60% market share or even higher. But this is the important fact to remember. Google released services such as Google Docs, YouTube, and especially the successful Google search engine. And due to all of these ads revenue, they could divert so much money into development that Google Chrome became the prominent web browser that had the most advanced features. Even if it wasn't the most efficient, it has those advanced features that meant all the others had to struggle to keep up with it. And this became very important and part of what the current situation has shaped. All right, I hope I made a good enough case for why I think the way in which Google entered this market was really an event that changed the course of time. Next, however, we have to also consider the fact that settling aside all the competition that was shaping up on the web browser market, however, it was this very important aspect of add-ons. Add-ons were developed, of course, because web browser developers had this ability presented to the users, mostly as a tool to attract additional attention and, of course, additional revenue. Just about any web service that was popular before 2000s and even later had some sort of toolbar that could be added to the web browser. And of course, it was a potential service to the user. However, most of them were developed as an attempt to find out better how users were searching for various items on the internet and how they were making various decisions. So it was mostly an intelligence tool that was included on the web browser. And of course, since it was so easy to install one, you just had to enter a website and then you could be shown an advert that looked like a pop-up, one that was released by the system, so it could be considered important. And it showed to you the proposal of installing the web tool that would help you a lot. And As you can see over here, there were so many tools made available. Google was also not to be left out of the discussion, and it offered features that were mostly pertaining to their interest. Yahoo, another very major platform that was on a very high success wave in the early 2000s, and more so before the 2000s, and others such as eBay, that of course was a web commerce website that was getting into prominence, Alexa, a web service that centered again on a competing search tool. Microsoft also had one. I cannot see it on, oh yes, it is Microsoft Software, Windows 2000. Yes, I think this one is the Microsoft web tool, the one that is colored in in orange. So just about any major web platform had a toolbar that could be added. Of course, the discussion goes even deeper than that, because of course some users had more than one toolbar installed, and all of them could extract data out of the user because they were entering this information in their own specific toolbar. So they could track it and then get all the information. Of course, this made web browsers even slower, but most users were not aware of that. And later, of course, major extensions, which are add-ons but with a different name, also came into prominence with various web browsers. And this was especially made popular by Google Chrome and Mozilla Firefox because they had the most extensive web developer support in the world, and this meant that many add-ons from I don't know, ones that were pertaining to entertainment, I don't know, searching jokes on the internet, to others that were making it possible to save various information you see, or organize it, or finding additional information quickly, or having ways to block adverts and so on, were even more popular. And of course, this meant that modern web browsers are already expected to have this add-on support and a good relationship with developers of such add-ons. Of course, even in this situation, things have been going sometimes better, sometimes worse, due to the interest of web developers and the interests of web browser developers that were not necessarily converging to the same perspective. And this meant that sometimes also there were bad outcomes. And especially so, thinking about how much interest was for a web developer to create a tool that was successful and mostly installed on their web browser, meant that there was also an incentive for developing tools for nefarious purposes, ones that could steal information, one that could spy, ones that could make various damage to the information that was stored in web browsers. Because this is also important. The moment those tools were developed, and those add-ons, because we are talking about the early 2000s, was also the time when more and more information was being held in a web browsers. All the discussion about cookies, about scripts, about passwords that weren't stored, of course, at that time in the web browser, but are so today, meant that so much information started to become available in web browsers, and it meant mostly a gold mine for developers that had the interest of extorting money out of users, even without, or better without, their knowledge. However, the situation is not as serious today, but there were times when such add-ons had a major impact on productivity and safety. However, I wanted to show to you this part of the retrospective because I thought that add-ons and the current situation we are in could not be understood if those toolbars and other various instruments were not available back then, and did not have the popularity they reached. So, getting to the current situation, I think that browsers have evolved a lot, and they offer major features that are useful to users. For instance, extensive automation support, in my opinion, is the most important one. Despite the capability of running just about any sort of application that could be used for interactive purposes, such as video clip playback support, or ones that are closer to virtual reality interactions or augmented reality ones. Setting them aside, I think that the most important one is that so many of our typical day-to-day interactions, such as entering accounts, using passwords, usernames, and knowing the names of specific websites we have previously used, is the most important feature that is available in any web browser. And the availability of such an information has simplified our activity in many ways, because we don't have to keep this information in another place than the one that has the application we use to access those informations. This is also good and bad when you think about it, because any sort of major disaster that could happen, data wiping, crashes, that could affect the profile and the information that was saved, could affect all of our productivity from that point further. And this is a major issue, I think, that we have to consider, and I mentioned it quite clearly over here. However, when all this information is stored and is accessible and everything goes as intended, the major features that modern browsers have really simplify our way in which we interact on the internet. Also, I think that there are other important aspects that we could be covering, but most of the way in which we structure information is very important, and web browsers made it much easier for us to do such a thing. Of course, things are far from perfect, because there is a lot that could be said about a better way in which information could be sorted, both in the history, in the bookmarks we have, and so on. However, the fact that the information is available and can be easily searched through various keywords is still an amazing feature in and of itself. Of course, all of these possibilities are made into reality through creative software developers, and this is very good. However, I also thought about another disadvantage, another one than just having all this information stored in a web browser that, of course, could crash and affect the profile that is being loaded every time it runs. And I think that the other more important risk is the one of having a near monopoly on software development, because web browsers are so essential to development, and because the resources being allocated to it have to be quite high. It means that few players can afford to create web browsers, and all of this can lead to potential monopoly risks. And this has been quite obvious in the case of Google Chrome, because its dominant position created a situation that sometimes could lead to unintended consequences for websites. And I will mention in passing the fact that, if I remember correctly, Google Chrome had the idea of a sites initiative that would entirely dismiss the entire concept of previously considered domains as governed by the international ruling bodies. And this meant that everything that is a domain today, both ones that were for countries and both ones that were for various commercial activities, could be replaced by this initiative of Google. And I think this was bad in itself, not only due to the fact that the previous good or bad way in which information was structured could be affected, because this would be one of the important outcomes. The other one would be that everything would be at the mercy of a specific company that had most of its own interests in mind. And in this case, I think that it goes on to show one of the more important risks. Another one, of course, we don't see it as such today, but it was an important fact some years prior. The fact that Google made it so obvious when a website was not using the secure HTTP protocol. And all of these attempts at shunning previously open communications, of course, that could be spied upon. That's no surprise. Even HTTPS is not entirely immune to that. However, meant that there was an important impact on the market that forced many players to acquire the necessary tools to make sure that their websites could communicate on the secure HTTP protocol. And this meant that a vast amount of money had to be spent on certificates and had to be spent on specific support for this, which wasn't considered necessary many years prior. And the secure HTTP protocol was mostly required in the case of, I don't know, banking transactions or anything else that pertain to critical or sensitive information. However, even in the case of your run-of-the-mill website, it was made obvious that this is what happened. And I remember another very important mistake in this case that was obviously possible due to the dominant position of Google. Websites that did not have the secure HTTP protocol available on their websites were lower ranked in searches, which was an obvious breach of equal treatment for all websites, which meant that it was a breach of freedom and a breach of true liberty. However, this is how things shaped. So it goes on to show what are the risks in this case. And of course, we had prior experience. The conflict between Microsoft and Netscape that dragged on for quite some years meant that the same risks were prior as well. And it meant that the way in which development was affected by these monopoly or near monopoly positions was quite obvious. However, there is no easy answer today, and I think that the most obvious one would be to develop a common international platform that could be forced to be used by all users. And all of these major developers would have to pile all their support to this, or find another way in which to force a dominant market player not to have a monopoly position through various means. But I just went on to show what are the risks. So I think that something has to be done in this respect. Or at least, if no change in the current monopoly is going to be held, force a common set of rules that all of these platforms had to abide. And in that case, we will probably see a much better, much improved situation, even if it's not going to be perfect. And I'm sure there are going to be various shortcomings that are possible due to the way in which the set of governing rules is going to be applied and, of course, stated. However, you also have to think about the perspective of web browsers. because I still see them as important applications that will probably have a major impact in the future. I think they will acquire any sort of new capability is going to be made available. So virtual reality, augmented reality handling and better support for them is clearly going to be on the forefront, even if not for the moment, it will probably be so in the future. As we change the way in which we interact with computers and the world that is being presented by them. Another important one would be automation. I still think that the automation, especially in terms of user interaction, is very lacking in most respects. And since we had to go through the hassle of making repetitive operations in various interfaces, I still think and I still hope that this will be possible in the future. And the best implementation would not probably be a system-wide approach, as is offered today by some software developer companies, but one that would be very well tied upon the web browser. Because having a very simple way of carrying out certain tasks that are to be carried out in various ways and having a way of understanding which is the correct approach, I think that such a capability being implemented in a web browser would lead to much better performance and much better results for end users. And it will probably level the field because those tools are quite costly and they are still not very easy to use. And of course, they are an advantage of various commercial enterprises, but there is clearly not a level playing field for typical users. So I think this one should be focused. Next, I mentioned the fact that web browsers and the way in which the web was designed was mostly as a text interface. Of course, this text interface later had additional support for images and various interactive content. However, I still think that it's very far from having the efficiency, the availability, the simplicity that could be made in development. And this is especially obvious when we think about the way in which we design websites. We had to use HTML, we had to use cascading style sheets, we had to use JavaScript, we had to use so many other tools and capabilities that are being placed upon the basic foundation of text interaction that makes web pages quite slow, not have a design that could be readily multiplied or used depending on situation, and make it to be very inefficient, highly inefficient, both in terms of networking resources and the ones pertaining to the device that displays the information, whether it's a laptop, it's a mobile phone, or any sort of other device. So web browsers are still a major waste of resources due to the fact that the web interface and the way in which websites were created is one that holds a lot of legacy behind. I still think that a major change is not going to happen. It will probably be a good development. However, a transition period still has to be ensured, and I think that the capability of running older websites as they are currently developed today will be mandatory for many years to come. Of course, I thought also about other features. For instance, website retrieval. There are tools that can capture websites, but I think that the way in which the information can be saved through a web browser has been sadly going downhill. Although the pervasiveness of the portable digital format, the PDF format, that is so well known, and that was designed, of course, by Adobe. You all too well this information. But the ability of it being so good in the sense of being a printed or a digital document that could be shared between all sorts of devices, from mobile phones, laptops, even to embedded devices, is not easy uh, get to, because most web browsers do not have an easy way of creating a PDF file, or if they do have a way of creating it, there are so many details of the interface that are not being reflected. So I still think that website retrieval support is very bad. And of course, I'm not talking about website retrieval, I'm talking about web capture, which is an intermediate step towards website retrieval. Website retrieval would probably require saving you an entire web page, and not only an entire web page, an array of pages that could be available on a specific website so that you could access it if something happens. For instance, I don't know, a site is being taken down and it has to be used as proof of a certain situation at a specific moment. And this is a tool that, of course, is not available in web browsers. I am pretty sure that there are reasons for which this development was not included as a standard support. Some of them may pertain to copyright, but I still think that the most important one would be the loss of revenue for certain websites, and this is one of the reasons for which this feature is not being implemented. And of course, I'm thinking about ads, but not only ads. So website retrieval I still think is important, also for educational purposes, and I had this in mind because sometimes we may need to recreate easily the perspective of a previous website. Of course, there are solutions such as the Internet Archive that cater very well to this situation. Unfortunately, there are websites that have not been indexed and that may be useful to index, and some users might have done so, but not having a uniform way of creating such a packaged website. Although I said there are tools, but it's most obvious to use the web browser to achieve this effect. And most users still hope such a feature will be available, or they expect it to be available, and then they find it's not the moment they use the web browser for the first time. So this is, I think, another thorny issue that would have to be addressed. Again, another aspect I think is covering native automated translation. Although there are tools and they are better or worse implemented in web browsers, I think that a standard feature that could be developed well enough and that could be working, whether we are talking about a available internet connection or offline activity, it should be possible, because most of the translation capability is mostly centered on using the internet and specific web services. So I still think that this is an important development that will come later and should come later and be better implemented. And of course there are some disadvantages, and I will cover some of them, some shortcomings that will be even more obvious in the future. I thought about this way of having a common interface, and data packaging is also important. And because web browsers are so successful and so versatile, I don't think that this packaging is going to become any more or substantially more complex or substantially more simple and efficient, just because web browsers are able to handle just about any sort of information organization. And of course, the computing capabilities of our devices are increasing, so that it's not a readily obvious requirement for improving efficiency. And as I said, the popularity of web browsers makes this to be still not a priority. Another important aspect, of course, centers to a unified, simplified website design. This is important for developers, but I think it's one of the major barriers of entry for many users that would like to create their own websites or would like to understand how things are done. And due to the complex way in which all the additional capabilities being shoehorned on the classic text interface of the internet, the HTML, because we still have HTML as a basic foundation for what we see on the internet, is one such major disadvantage. So for a short intermission, I still think that web browsers are a slightly frustrating experience, and the internet overall, because even if we have so many possibilities, we have such a large potential, we are still hindered mostly by what happens when we use those tools and when we make our attempts at improving them. And I thought that this picture summarizes very well in an ironic way the facts we sometimes see on the internet, even if they are not as outrageous as it may be suggested. The fact is that many times we are being surprised by how wrong things can go. And I thought about this, and of course the picture shows a very nicely acting lady that of course carries the message very well. So I hope you liked it. And we are close to the end. So summarizing everything that pertained up to this point, we have to think how all these developments in web browsers changed our perspective. And there are some key aspects I would like to present. It's quite obvious that the vast amount of information that we had on the internet could not be easily structured in any other way up until this point without having a web browser. And I still think that web browsers are fantastic in this regard. Their availability, their development really made sure that we kept the pace of development and productivity as well as entertainment enjoyment. Well, another major victory for web browsers is the fact that so many services we use on the internet can be very easily accessed using a web browser, and everything that pertains to the way in which those websites show this information is possible due to web browser capabilities. And in this respect, I also think about user accounts, because entering passwords and usernames is such a common occurrence that we previously had to carry by using various other means, such as writing this information on a piece of paper, on a notepad, on a notebook, on post-it notes, on just about any sort of file we could place on the computer that could handle them. And of course, we lost different amount of time. Of course, that could vary from situation to situation in order to retrieve this information. And of course, as more websites asked us to have different passwords and to have more complex passwords, the hassle of entering them was quite obviously getting higher and higher. And web browsers had kept the pace of innovation by saving all these passwords and taking note of the place, the website, the domain, the web address, ultimately, that is being used when we have to enter this information. So in this case, I think that the features being offered by web browsers are very well put to good use. Another one, of course, that the availability of running videos and interactive content was one of the major advances that we had in the last 20 years. And all of this important development could not have been thought about without having the capability directly implemented and improved as time went on in the web browsers. Of course, web browsers should not be considered without taking into account the operating system and the hardware capabilities. However, web browsers could be made with better or worse handling of this, as it was proven in time. And for instance, the emergence of HTML5, instead of using Adobe Flash container capabilities, proved that there was a massive improvement that could be had just by using well-developed and well-thought-of standard. Next, cross-platform optimizations and capabilities are very important for our current perspective on what our current expectations, to be more precise, regarding web access. And web browsers that were optimized for various devices, however retaining essential features, are a very important achievement. And the vast amount of information we have to use, we have to collect and structure, is mostly due to web browsers and the way in which web browsers had made this information to be more easily available. And think about preferences, think about history, think about bookmarks. All of these features were not implemented in the first iteration of web browsers, but became standard capabilities that we expect and we use a lot in order to guide our time we spend on the internet. And also, we have to admit the fact that web services such as virtual conferences and collaboration features, including document editing by multiple users, could not be thought about without the interface that is being provided by web browsers and everything that is being handled in interaction between various users using the web browser. So I have to give it to them. Web browsers were a wonderful development. However, there are risks that have to be considered. And despite its massive popularity, there are risks of entering so much information and having various, of course, mistakes that could be done either by users or developers that could lead to major vulnerabilities. And I think this covers the entire story of how web browsers improved our potential. Because ultimately, we had better access to information that other persons created for us, and we had better tools to create this information and present it in a specific way. So both sides of the public were very well served by this development, and I still think that it's a major achievement. So in the end, I think this is just about web setup. There may be more other things to say. I hope that I wasn't overly concerned with something and got you slightly bored due to this. I thank you very much for paying attention, and if you had the patience to watch the entire video, I hope you enjoyed it, and if you do so, please subscribe to the channel and share your comments if you would like. I appreciate all the interactions that are made possible through this environment. So thank you very much for watching.